I am Tammy Schneider, and I am the Dean of the School of Arts, Humanities, and Religion that is sponsoring this. And I am thrilled to have all of you here. I see a lot of repeat offenders in the audience because we have had a number of events already this semester. So thank you for coming back, those of you that were here earlier. This is actually our second event this semester talking about women's ordination. Our first event was actually a joint dialogue with the Mormon women and Catholic women, and so this whole topic has been on the front burner at CGU for all semester, I guess you could say. We are very excited to have Father Roy with us, both for tonight and those of you who can make it tomorrow at 1 o'clock. He will be speaking in this room again on a slightly different topic, but you are all invited and welcome to join us tomorrow as well. I don't want to take up the whole evening blithering on, but I just want to thank you all for coming and remind you that because CGU is the first graduate program in the country with a program in women's studies and religion, these are the kinds of events and these are the kinds of things that we think about and talk about and invite speakers to discuss with us most of the time. And while she could not be here tonight, we are also the home of Karen Jo Torgerson, who wrote the book When Women Were Priests. And so again, tonight's topic is not something that we just decided to because we could nab Father Roy for this evening, but this is something that the whole issues about the role of women in religion and how that plays out both in the past and in the future. These are the things that we think about all the time, and we train our students to unpack what are the issues involved. So thank you all for coming, and with no further ado, and I want to thank profusely, the Women's Ordination Conference, who are co-sponsoring with this and have been very helpful and supportive, and thank you. So here is Marcy Cox, who is going to introduce this evening.
As I think many of you are, I'm very excited about our guest speaker, Father Roy. He's a Catholic priest, member of the Mary Knoll Order, and an activist dedicated towards ending social justice. He's also been my hero since I was 18, so I'm actually shaking. I'm so excited. He became involved in issues surrounding U.S. policy in El Salvador in 1990. He founded the School of the Americas Watch, an office that does research on the U.S. Army School of the Americas, the SOA, which has now been renamed the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, or WINSEC, at Fort Benning, Georgia. Father Roy is also a strong supporter of the women's ordination movement and has been threatened with defrocking as a result of speaking out and calling for women to be ordained to the Catholic Church. He has participated in multiple documentaries focused on human rights issues, including the Oscar-nominated School of Assassins and most recently, Pink Smoke Over the Vatican. He was the recipient of the 1997 Pax Christi USA Teacher of Peace Award and is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee for his continuous work towards ending social injustice. Father Roy continues to travel extensively, giving talks at universities, churches, and other groups around the country. We're so thrilled to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm just really honored to be with you, with Jane and Rosemary and Gina. I want to begin with an apology. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I really want to begin with an apology to all the women in the Catholic Church and also, I think, in society for taking so long to see this injustice, to see the root of our church's teaching all about sexism. No excuses. I was asleep, I think, for many years, and one of the many participating in what we call prejudice. I have come to see after much reflection that in life, prejudice is our greatest enemy. We learn prejudice, and we can unlearn it. Growing up in Louisiana, I'm ashamed to say that I went to 12 years of segregated public schools. Our little church, Catholic church, where we worshiped was segregated. The last 5 pews for our black sisters and brothers. And looking back over those years in that little town in Louisiana, I cannot recall our principal, a teacher or a macho football coach, our priest, a parent or myself or my classmates saying, we've got a problem here. It's called racism. What I do remember was the mantra, separate but equal. And it is our tradition. And every time I hear that word mentioned by the Vatican tradition, I think about how tradition can be the root of evil, of sin. How so much of our tradition simply justifies discrimination. After leaving the State University with a degree in geology, I entered the military. It was my ticket out of Louisiana. Really a time to get educated, a time to explore, an adventurous time. And in my 4th year in the military, I volunteered for this war in Vietnam. They said our cause was noble. We were going to be the liberators. I bought into that great lie. That great prophet Isaiah says it so well. They will take a lie and call it truth. They will take evil and call it good. And I and so many of us bought into that lie, into that evil. But Vietnam became that turning point in my life. I had never seen such violence, suffering, and death. Death was very close, and my faith became, and God became much closer to me. And in the madness of war, I must say, I learned something very important, but it was only the beginning, that we are not made for war. We cannot go about the business of killing and go on with our lives as before. We've learned this in Iraq, Afghanistan. We're not made for war. But it was in Vietnam, in the madness of it all, that I felt God calling me to the priesthood. I didn't know what to do with that because every time I saw a priest, I turned around and went the other way. I talked to this army chaplain about what to do with that. He recommended the Maryknoll order. I said, Mary who? He said they work in 25 countries around the world, serving the poorest of the poor. It sounded great. It gave me hope because really war kills hope, and I and so many of us had lost our hope in Vietnam. And I came home. It was just such a happy time. I wept when that plane took off from Saigon, coming back to be with our family and friends. It was a new beginning. And those years in the seminary were good, challenging years. Ordained and now sent to serve the poor of Bolivia, where the poor now became my teachers, where they really introduced to this gringo who knew nothing about our foreign policy, what it meant to those on the receiving end of our foreign policy. We were supporting a very brutal dictator, General Bonser, one of the many we were supporting, propping up, training their thugs. But it was in Bolivia where I was introduced to a new theology that Rosemary has written about often, that theology of liberation. And just briefly, it's a theology that gives hope to people. So different from that theology, very colonial theology that I was weaned on, where you're told really to be silent, to accept your suffering as the will of God, and to look forward to the next life. This is where your joy will come. How cruel. But this theology empowers the poor. They realize that our loving Creator gave every country enough resources for everyone to live comfortably, where there's enough food for everyone, where there doesn't have to be the oppression and exploitation and hunger as there is today in most of the developing world. And it was in liberation theology where they talk about coming to that same table. It's a new model of church, a discipleship of equals, where all are called to that table as equals, where no one can say that they are superior to another. And out of liberation theology comes that all-important word, solidaridad, solidarity. Simply means to accompany, to walk with, to make the struggle of others your struggle. And wow, I was learning so much. My life had meaning. But in my 5th year, I was among the many arrested in Bolivia for living out that word, solidaridad. And I was kicked out of the country. One of the lucky ones, many were killed, tortured. I came home and it was a difficult time. Tried to get back, visa denied. My attention turned to El Salvador, a country far worse than the one I came from. Archbishop Oscar Romero had just been assassinated. 4 churchwomen from our country, just months later, raped and killed by the Salvadoran military that we were arming and training. 2 of the women, Mara Clark and Ida Ford of the Marino community, were good friends of so many of us. There was Dorothy Kazel of the Ursuline community, and Jean Donovan. I was in Cleveland just a couple weeks ago, and how their presence is still felt there. It shook us, so many people in the United States. El Salvador now became much closer to home. We went there and found such brutality. I'd never seen such brutality of a military. And once again, we found our country, the United States, deeply involved, giving guns and training to those doing the killing. And the $1 million a day we were pumping into that country all came from our taxes, all done in our name. And when 500 Salvadoran soldiers came to Fort Benning, Georgia to start training, a small group of us went there to say no, not in our name. We protested. They sent us to prison for 1.5 years. No regrets. It was all about solidarity. And I must confess, I did pretty well in prison. I didn't know it, but those years in the seminary were good preparation for prison. We left prison, our hope and joy was intact. So many of us, tens of thousands, all over the country trying to stop that military aid to El Salvador, but we couldn't do it. Now they went after the Jesuits at their university there in San Salvador. And after midnight, November the 16th, 1989, the military entered their campus, dragged them out of their rooms, and shot them at close range. Killed with them were their co-worker, Elba, a young mother, and her teenage daughter, Selena. And this made the front pages of our newspapers all over the world. A congressional task force is sent to from Washington to investigate. They come back reporting that those who did the killing were trained at the U.S. Army School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia. That's when I and a small group of us, 10 of us, went down to investigate the school, and what we found was serious. A school of assassins, a school that had trained over 50,000 soldiers from 18 countries in Latin America in commando tactics, counterinsurgency. And what we learned was important. The insurgents were the poor, as they've always been. They were the labor leaders, like in Colombia, where most of the soldiers are coming from today. They are the university students and professors, the spiritual leaders, healthcare workers, human rights leaders, anyone who threatens that system is seen as an insurgent and killed, disappeared, tortured. And what this school was all about, really, was protecting, providing the muscle in these countries to protect U.S. economic interest. It was all about cheap labor, the exploitation of cheap labor and resources. And when we learned from the United Nations that those who killed Bishop Romero raped and killed the church women, the Jesuits, the 2 women with them, and the list went on, were trained at this school, something happened. Our movement just blossomed. We said, let's go down to Georgia every November, that weekend before Thanksgiving, and to express our solidarity with our sisters and brothers of these countries, to keep their memories alive, and to call for the closing of this school of assassins. And our numbers grew from 10 to 1,000 to 5,000, 10,000, 20,000. And now we're getting ready to go back to Georgia. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, November the 17th and 18th. I know some of you have been there. It'd be a great blessing if you could check it out. Go to our website, soaw.org. But let me just say, we're filled with hope now. Delegations representing our movement have been to some 15 countries. We've met with 6 presidents, defense ministers, university leaders, and others. And I'm happy to report that 6 countries have withdrawn their troops from that school. 2 of them just this past year, the last 5 months. We were in Ecuador where we met with President Rafael Correa. And he said it well. He said, this school should not exist. Ecuador's pulling out. That was country number 5. And then just a month ago, we were in Nicaragua, where President Daniel Ortega at the meeting announced that Nicaragua will no longer be sending their troops there. November the 13th, we have our first meeting at the White House. We've been trying to get this meeting for over a year. And we're hopeful. We're going to be with one of Obama's top foreign advisors. Let me just say, we're not going away. We're keeping our hands on the plow. We're going to keep at it until that school is shut down. This school should not exist. But it was in this movement for the last really 20 years, addressing that injustice of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America and that school of the Americas, that I was introduced to an injustice much closer to home, in my church, in my backyard. I began to meet all these very devout Catholic women who shared with me their deep faith in so many churches where I was speaking, in colleges, who talked of their call by God to the priesthood. And what I heard kept me awake at night. And it's amazing, I remember the first time I was confronted with this. I brought up that word, tradition. Well, that's our tradition. Ashamed to say. But what happened, the more I heard their stories, the more I had to think about this, and what I had to do was ask some very basic questions. And this was not very heavy theology here. First, I had to say that we profess as Catholics in most faith traditions, we profess that our loving God created men and women of equal worth and dignity, that we are made in the image and likeness of God. All priests, beginning with the Pope on down, we all use the same language. The call to the priesthood is a gift. A gift. And that call comes from God. None other than God. And this was the all-important question I had to ask. Who are we as men to say to women, our call is authentic, but your call is not? Who are we as men to reject God's call of women to the priesthood? What arrogance. And what I saw in our church's teaching at its very root was that sin of sexism. And as we all know, sexism, like racism, like homophobia, and all those other forms of discrimination, is wrong. It's wrong. And no matter how hard we may try to justify discrimination against others, in the end, it is never the way of God. And in this issue of women not being ordained, it is the way of men. Little men with little hearts and little faith who have made God in their image. A little God that they worship. And what I saw here was a grave injustice being done against women. An injustice against our church that is in such a crisis today. And of course, an injustice against our loving God who calls both men and women to the priesthood. What do we do, you and I, when we see an injustice with such clarity? What we do know is silence is the voice of complicity. And in order to sleep at night, I had to break my silence. And I must confess, I did it in little baby steps. Wherever I would speak, I'd bring in the women. So they started getting the package deal. I started bringing in the women's ordination issue. And saying things like at the end, well, if we had women priests and women bishops, this School of the Americas would have been shut down a long time ago. And people would laugh. But they were thinking about it maybe. And then came the invitation to go to Rome to speak at a big conference of women religious and priests. A few hundred gathered. And they wanted to talk on U.S. foreign policy and the SOA. And it was well received there, the message. And the last day I was invited, before leaving Rome, I was invited to speak on Vatican Radio for 15 minutes, a live interview about foreign policy. And it went really well for 13 minutes. And I just knew the Spirit was moving. We've all been there. We know that this opportunity will never present itself again. And I just had to say it. There will never be justice in our church until women can be ordained. And our And I remember it was going out in different languages, and the guy next to me, one of the translators, he looked like he didn't want to say it. So I had to kind of nudge him a little bit. But anyways, then I wanted to say a little more about sexism. Maybe said a few words about that. But then the manager walked in, very upset, and the Gregorian chants started coming in. The interview was over. I have to tell you, I slept very well that night. Came home, got a call. There was a call waiting from the Marino headquarters in New York. Word had gotten to them. And we weren't able, we just talked about it over the phone. No need to come up here. Just don't go back, back to Rome for a while. And then came the invitation to attend and to participate. First, to attend, the invitation said the ordination of one of the many women called. In this case, Janice Severodzinska, a longtime peace activist, one of our many prisoners. We've had over 350 of our people who have crossed the line at Fort Benning and have gone off to prison for 6 months. And she being among them, our prisoners of conscience. Janice, a teacher, called to the priesthood like so many of our women, and simply could not say no to that call. After much discernment and preparation, and that day came. And I simply wrote to her and said it would be a great joy to attend, an honor really. And she asked me to co-celebrate, and to be one of the homilists. And sure, why not? And I knew it might be poking that beehive of patriarchy, but we'll see. And it was a wonderful, wonderful ordination ceremony, my first. It was really my very first introduction to the women's ordination movement. And I was humbled. I was filled with joy. A couple hundred there to share that vision of Janice, her call to serve the church. And but I came back, and that joy was not shared by the Vatican. It was just less than 2 months later, I received a very, very serious letter from the Vatican. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal William Levada, the same cardinal who wrote the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. And it's amazing they use that same word, scandal. Scandal. The letter began by saying, I had caused grave scandal in our church by participating and supporting publicly the ordination of women. And I had 30 days to recant, or I would be excommunicated automatically. They always like to bring in some Latin, late sententiae, like everyone speaks Latin. When I saw that word latte, I thought we were going to have a latte and talk about this. But really, first, that word scandal, I thought about when most Catholics hear the word scandal, they do not think about the ordination of women. I canceled a trip to Latin America, one of our delegations, and withdrew into solitude for a couple weeks. I wanted to really get this right. This letter I felt was going to be very important. And I sent it off to the Vatican, my response. And I really focused in on that issue of conscience, the sacredness and primacy of conscience. How so many of us Catholics have been taught that. I know that's one of the few things I remember growing up Catholic. that our conscience really is our lifeline to God. Our conscience enables us to discern right from wrong and always urges us to do the right thing. And when we follow our conscience, wow, we're at peace. We sleep well at night. There's a joy that we feel in our hearts. And when we don't follow our conscience, I know I've been there, many of you have, we're tormented. We're torn. And I simply said in my letter, what you're asking me to do is to lie. To say to you that I do not believe that God calls both men and women to serve our church as priests. This I will not do. I will not betray my conscience. And that was my response 3 years ago. That's my response today, and that will be my response tomorrow. I never got a letter. I never got a response back. Really, I mean, I answer all of my mail. I mean, maybe they're going through some budget cuts at the Vatican. They can't afford stamps. Not even the decency of a response. I remember in the military, we even got a response to our letters. Letter received. Request denied. I consulted my good friend, Bishop Tom Gummilton. Many of you know Tom. Different canon lawyers. Some at Maryknoll. They says, go about your work. You haven't heard anything. And I did. More than ever before, I began to speak out publicly against this grave injustice. And then not long ago came a letter from Maryknoll under great pressure from Cardinal Levada, from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, saying, your member has not recanted. Not only has he not recanted, but he's speaking out all over the place. And you must kick him out of the order if he does not recant within 15 days. The Vatican gave me 30, now he's saying 15 to Maryknoll. And so I went up to Maryknoll. They said it was important to meet. And then I said, you know, let's have a discussion about this. I started asking them basic questions. What do we say to women who are called to the priesthood as we are called? And I bring up that important question, who are we to reject God's call of women? And there was silence. And the superior general and the council members, each in different ways, said, Roy, don't you understand that Pope John Paul II, in his document way back in 1994, said that he had made a decision. Women cannot be ordained. It's definitively held, and many interpret that to be infallible. And there will be no more discussion about this. Oh, really? And I could only, when they said this, don't you understand that we can't be discussing this? And I remember I just said, well, as an adult, I find this offensive. And I said, I don't know if you are aware of this, but there is this big debate and discussion about women being ordained in our church. And the majority support the ordination of women. And I know you don't believe in polls, but polls like the New York Times, CBS, Associated Press, and many others, Georgetown, Catholic University reported that something like 65%, and that was a couple of years ago. There's more now, a greater percentage, support the ordination of women. But there was no discussion. I left let me just say, it was a very low time in my life, just very down. And then came the vote. The Superior General didn't have the power to simply kick me out. He and the council, 5 members, had to vote for my dismissal. And it was a close call, I must say. And I must say they didn't have the votes required for dismissal. And this was very important to me. It was, for me, an expression of solidarity. This has been my family for 40 years. And that was much more personal than the letter from the Vatican. And they encouraged me to get a good canon lawyer, which I did. Tom Doyle, a Dominican. And he said, when he took my case, he said, pro bono, this is about solidarity. This is about an issue that I believe in. And he said, I must warn you, we are going up against the most corrupt group of men that I have ever dealt with. This is coming from my canon lawyer. And he says, do not expect too much. Wow. That word corrupt I keep hearing in reference to our church leaders at the Vatican. I'm feeling more at peace because of that vote in my community, the Maryknoll community, who told me after that vote, I went back just recently for our very first discussion. Incredible, for 2 hours. We talked about the ordination of women. We talked about conscience, that all-important issue, conscience. And we talked about the right that we have as people of faith and adults to express freely our beliefs without being threatened with excommunication. I couldn't believe it, really. I left that meeting, and my canon lawyer was there, Tom Doyle. And we had our very first, with the Superior and the General Council, I and my canon lawyer, our very first discussion just a few months ago. And he assured me that I was still a member of the community. And he said, let's continue to discuss this issue, which gave me great hope. But I don't know what's the next step from the Vatican. We will see. But I do know that I will continue to speak out as you are. Just some very brief reflections, and then I'll close. I've learned so much over these last few years when I broke my silence. The first is I had no idea how deep the sexism was in our church. Perhaps naive, but being a member of that clerical culture, I didn't see it until I broke my silence. I didn't understand how deep that sexism was. The women in the movement have become like 3 women here, my teachers. The men like Janice and the other women, especially in the women's ordination movement, they have become my teachers, like the poor became my teachers in Bolivia. And they said, you know, whenever we talk about sexism, we must address the issue of power. Power. And I began to see that so clearly, that issue of power, and how so many of my longtime friends in the priesthood see women as a threat to our power. And I was quite shocked and hurt, really, baffled by longtime friends in the priesthood who I've never heard from again after I broke my silence. That's how angry and threatened they can become. That somehow they made me believe or sent the message that you have joined the enemy. Wow. Another issue that really saddened me was that whole issue of blind obedience. Blind obedience. That can be so dangerous, as we learned from the Nuremberg trials. It never stood up at that court. I was following orders. In fact, I saw some hope. That was some time back, when I was invited, that was a couple years ago, invited at our annual meeting up at Marino to give a presentation on women's ordination one evening before the community. Wow. I saw this as a breakthrough. I said, we are going to have our first community discussion. And so I just threw out a few, things, sharing personally my struggle and why I broke my silence on this issue and the issue of sexism. But then the first question, and the second, and the third. What about your vow of obedience to our superiors and to the Pope? Wow. And I just said, well, where does God come in here? How can we possibly, when you think about it, take an oath of allegiance, like today priests and bishops, especially bishops, have to take this oath of allegiance, as Hans Kung reminds us, an oath of allegiance to the Pope, that you will never disobey. Wow. This is dangerous. And one other issue I thought about more recently. We say that we are made in the image of God, in the image and likeness of God. But what I've been thinking about more is how we as men, or as any person of faith, but how we, especially in this all-clerical culture, men, have made God in our image. A little God. A God who is very male and often very white. And how this God somehow discriminates, has favorites. And his favorites are the celibates. Are the priests, the church leaders. But there's a problem. Today Catholics are more educated, and that's not their image of God. We're no longer in that church of the yes father, no father. Today we are more educated. And I thought the letter that the Vatican sent to the women religious really clarified and will certainly advance the cause when they said it very well in that letter. We are the the authentic teachers of faith and morals in the church. And how these men at the Vatican, all men, investigated for 3 years an all-female organization with no women in that investigation. And then after their 3 years, this is what we have found. This is what we see, and they use that word, scandal, radical feminism, and other issues they bring up. And what they are saying, and this is, I'm hoping that somehow will come out at some point to clarify this. What these men are saying is that only we as men can interpret the Holy Scriptures. We've been saying this for 2,000 years. And only men can know the will of God and hold the truth. Well, there's a word for that. It's called heresy. Heresy. But having said this, I must say, I, like so many, I'm angry. I'm sad. I have thought of leaving the church, but as so many have expressed, I'm not leaving. This is our church. I'm going to stay in. I don't like bullies. I never did like them in high school. I didn't like them in Bolivia, El Salvador. I don't like them in our church. They're abusing their power. And the problem with bullies, if you just let them be and leave, they continue to abuse their power and resort to their bullying tactics. I'm staying in like you. And I'm going to fight and do all I can to reform our church. And in doing that, in closing, I must say I'm filled with a lot of hope, great hope. Because I've been doing so much reflecting and thinking and reading. At one of my I want to mention this to Rosemary at dinner. There was a time, 2 years ago was a real rough time. I will remember one of those dark nights of the soul. Actually, it was a dark week of the soul. Not getting a whole lot of support, just feeling very alone. And I went into this bookstore and I found this book, Catholics Does Not Equal the Vatican, by Rosemary Rather. And I pull it out every now and then. I brought it with me. But that book really did something to me. It inspired me. It gave me hope. It reminded me why I should not leave and why I should not be angry or sad. Maybe angry, but why I should have hope. And really, there were many who tried to stop the abolition of slavery. They failed. There were many who tried to stop the women's suffrage movement. You know this better than I. I'm fascinated by these books I read about their struggle. Wow, how hard that was and how they suffered. Women who who wanted the right to vote. And how Cardinal Gibbons in the Catholic Church and many Catholic leaders opposed the right of women to vote and used the church money and their powerful voices to stop that. They failed. They failed. And there are many who tried to stop the civil rights movement. They failed. And there are many who are trying in our church to stop the ordination of women. Those at the Vatican, our bishops and priests here, many of you know them. And of course, they will fail. Simply because these movements are rooted in love. These movements are rooted in justice. They are rooted in equality. And it's the very root. There is God, an all-loving creator who loves us unconditionally, who does not discriminate. It's not a word in God's vocabulary, who sees everyone, every person of any race, gender, sexual orientation. We are all of equal worth and dignity. We are all loved the same, unconditionally. And for that, I am filled with great hope, knowing too we have a lot of work ahead of us. And I just hope that we can walk together, living out that word, solidarity. Thank you.